name's Christine Beckman. I'm a faculty member associated with the Center for Social Innovation, and I'm delighted to be having a conversation today with Tara Roth, who is the president of the Goldhirsh Foundation, a foundation here in LA that supports social innovation. Tara's background is in marketing and business development. She was the founding COO of an organization called, did you just call it GOOD? Which does social strategy advising on brands and messaging around social impact for companies, sort of, and has worked with a lot of different organizations, one being New Schools Venture Fund, which is how I actually first met Tara. So she's got her undergraduate degree from Cornell. She got her MBA at Oxford. And for those of you that were here a few weeks ago listening to Mark Ventresca, he was a professor when she was getting her MBA. So we've got a nice little small world connection here for that. She's on the LA Sustainability Leadership Council, on the Lyft City Works Advisory Council, and last but not least, on the board of the Price School here as well. So thank you very much for joining us, and we'll sort of get started. So maybe first, can you just tell us a little bit about your organization? And the website says you exist for social innovators and run by social innovators. So tell us a little bit about what that means for you.
Thank you, and it's so great to see you, and I'm so happy to be here and excited to talk with you all today. So the Goldhirsh Foundation is a private family foundation based here in Los Angeles. It was endowed by the sale of Inc. magazine, so we have this strong emphasis on media and entrepreneurship in our DNA. We're about a $60 million foundation, an endowment, so that means that our charitable expenses and grants every year are about $3 million. So Ben Goldhirsh, who is the founding CEO of Good magazine, where I was on the founding team as the COO, doing a lot of the marketing and everything else that one does when you're in a startup, that you're just, okay, where's the toilet paper for the bathroom, or whatever you need to do. Ben and I are very interested in taking risks and experimenting, and Ben's wife Claire is also on the board, and she's a working journalist and novelist. So it's an interesting mix where I feel really lucky to have this to work with a family, but it's also a professional entity. So the organization operates a little bit like a venture capital fund for social good. We think about capital in different ways. We think about financial capital, which is our endowment, from which we make loans, investments, and our grants. We talk about human capital. Some of this is actually from New Schools days. Human capital, wherein we provide operational and strategic assistance and counsel, and we sometimes act as extended members of the teams that we're supporting with our financial capital. And then we have social capital, wherein we market, promote, and amplify the work of the organizations we're supporting. So we may make an introduction to another funder or investor. We may promote different organizations' job and event opportunities. We originally were started to bring different groups that had proven models outside of Los Angeles to Los Angeles, in addition to working directly in LA. So we brought City Year to Los Angeles. We brought Peer Health Exchange to Los Angeles. Harlem Lacrosse, which is actually a merger, and Lyft, which, not to be confused with the Lyft. I'm on the LYFT board of counselors, and Lyft is an anti-poverty organization that was founded from an undergraduate at Yale many years ago. So we originally were doing that work, and we started thinking about, we're making great bets on individual organizations, and we're applying all the different forms of capital. But if we're focused on Los Angeles and we have kids who are now graduating well from City Year, do they have jobs that they can go to where they can earn a good income and have purpose in their lives? We're working with Peer Health Exchange. They work on health outcomes for kids. Is there a healthy environment? So we initiated LA2050, which is a community guided vision about what Los Angeles should look like in 2050. We basically gave it a report card about around 8 different community well-being indicators. We used academics here at USC, UCLA, Loyola Marymount, who came up with these different elements. We have then rolled those into 5 different goals. So think about it as like very marketable, sustainable development goals, making LA the best place to play, create, connect, learn, and live. Within each of those, we have about 10 to 12 metrics we measure against. And then we have a grants challenge where we give away the majority of our funds in an online crowdsourced grants challenge that's called My LA2050. So that's kind of in broad strokes, like who we are. We've done a lot of different work with governments. We work with the Mayor's Fund here in Los Angeles. We worked with the Obama White House on entrepreneurship. We've done a lot of different, we test a lot. And I think that's part of what makes our work innovative, and what also makes it interesting for me.
So social innovation is sort of that's our center, and it means a lot of things to a lot of different people. What does it? How do you define it? How do you think about social innovation?
Yeah, I think that there are a few different ways I think about it, and I think about it as basically taking new or even existing that are not known solutions and bringing them together to try to find outcomes for a social or environmental ill. And I think about it as you're trying to make a systems change, not just alleviate a burden at a certain amount of time. I think about it with a few different elements. One is that there needs to be a necessity or a social market gap that's been identified by the innovator who comes to bring this to the table. There needs to be a hustle or an urgency from the person who wants to put forth an idea for funding. And then there needs to be also non-experts working together. You need experts and non-experts. And I think that that's where we find that real change can occur when people are not afraid to ask stupid questions because they're not the expert, so they're expected to ask questions. And then the way that we work with them is we try to figure out ways that we can be helpful and additive to an organization or an idea. So we're very willing to take a risk on a person who has a great idea, who demonstrates the passion, the urgency, the persistence, the preparedness. There's some big P's in here that are really key, I think, to social innovation. And also we don't care if it's a for-profit, a non-profit, or a governmental entity. I think that that's part of what characterizes us a little bit differently. We've had successes and failures with taking risks on nonprofits and for-profits and government entities. And the way, for instance, the My LA2050 Grants challenge is set up is it's all three of those entities can apply. We did something early on when MTV was more relevant, so a decade or so ago. We worked with a number of different foundations to make a big investment in MTV to set up a pro-social platform. We got a lot of pushback from the nonprofit sector saying, why are you doing this with a for-profit company? And we said, we're trying, we're testing, we're going where younger minds and doers are, and we're trying to incentivize and encourage pro-social action. It didn't go anywhere, but it was a really good experiment, and we're willing to take those risks.
Yeah, that was one of the things I noticed from just looking at your website and looking at all the different things you fund. You fund a really diverse array of initiatives and programs and organizations across different sectors. So I wanted to actually ask you a little bit more about that. Funding a government program versus funding a social entrepreneur versus working with a nonprofit. How are there differences in what you look for or how you assess success? How do you think about those engaging with all of those very different kinds of organizations?
I'd say it's probably similar across the board, that much in the same way you might hear someone talking about an investment. I mean, we're not in it we want to make a return so that we can then have grant dollars to invest. But we're also trying to be very intentional about most of our investments. I would say this is all a work in progress, but we're looking for those elements of what makes a good entrepreneur and what makes someone possibly able to be a good disruptor within government. So for instance, one of the organizations, we work with the Mayor's Fund, I reference, and we worked with a woman who had worked at GOOD. So we knew her, she was tested, and we knew she had a good vision. And she came up with this idea. She said, you all are working on LA2050, which is really about a common vision and a common goal. How can I do that at a larger systems level, which we recognize our limitations within philanthropy or within our respective communications channels? What could she do? So she came up with this idea about branding Los Angeles. So she worked with a great branding firm here in LA. We paid for her to be part of in the mayor's office. And she came up with a brand that some of you may have seen. It's there's a long L and there's an A, and then they'll put like Roy Choi's face goes in there, or there's sprinkled cupcakes, or there are a number of different things. So she came up with this, and then she said, I want to give back in the same way that the I Heart New York brand gives back to New York. So she has launched something called LA Originals, that they have a space in LAX, they have a space in the library, they have pop-up spaces, and they sell products that are made by LA-made designers, artisans, whatnot, and then a portion of those proceeds goes to the Downtown Women's Center, which I think is another great social innovation and happens to be another one of our grantees. So we'll look at her. I look at where sort of the messaging, she's measuring how much messaging mind share she has, how many people have heard of LA Original, and then I look at her sales. So, and again, this was a kind of it falls in the non-investment return, but I'm looking at it how's her investment return looking? Then with some of the others, I might say, okay, did this LA Department of Transportation, that's another example of working with the government. We put someone as a fellow in there to come up with a transportation technology plan that this was about 4 years ago, included autonomous vehicles and with an equity lens for public transportation. And I look at how many of those recommendations that came from that report have now been implemented. So sometimes it's a long evaluation process. Sometimes it's the My LA2050 Grants Challenge. We give 1-year grants. So we ask people right up front, how many volunteers are you going to recruit and train? How many kids are you going to graduate? It's really easy to measure that from an outputs perspective, less from an outcomes perspective. And then with longer term, I can look at some of the outcomes of like, how are we thinking this is going in the field?
Mm-hmm. Terrific. Well, let me follow up on that, actually thinking about metrics and outputs and outcomes, and so that seems like you've talked on a couple of different issues that's important. That seems to be important to you. How do you think about what the right metrics are, and how do those get sort of developed? Can you talk a little bit about that? Sure. I think that's super interesting.
The most interesting metrics experiment, I'm going to say, that we've done, or a framework that we've put in place, is with LA2050. So I mentioned we had what was important to us right up front was we had academically rigorous metrics in place. So that's why we relied on the academics, and we said, okay, we're paying you all. We're paid a public affairs firm to come up with the academic advisory council, and they came up with different metrics. So there are about 60 metrics within. So percentage of imported water, the mileage for walking to a green space or park, recidivism rates. A number of different things that we knew we didn't have the expertise to come up with. And so we had those in place, and then what we did was something that we really wanted to test this with the community, because we thought we don't want this to be a top-down approach, we want this to be bottom-up. So we initiated something called LA2050 Listens, which was a grants competition to give 20 organizations $5,000 to bring these metrics to their respective communities and test them and say, what's missing? What shouldn't be here? So we had groups who conducted the LA2050 Listen sessions in Tagalog and Spanish. We let them do it however they wanted to do it. So we had a group of First Nation people doing a basket weaving while doing a conversation about the metrics. And what we found was there was a lot of similarity between the metrics that were put forth by the academics and the experts with the non-experts. And there were also new metrics that were put forth called dream metrics by the community groups. And the reason they were called dream metrics was because metrics are put in place to be measured. You have to look at consistent sources year in, year out to know that you're going to get data back about the measurement. And so these were metrics that people said we'd like to be measured against this, but we don't. But we then back in the office said there is no consistent measurement in place. So we have a mix of dream metrics and metrics against which we measure, which we really let people tell us when they apply to us how they're fitting into the different metrics. We rely on a kind of a self-reporting.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But that's sort of your overarching frame around. So to go back to Mark Ventresca for a second.
Mm-hmm.
When he was here a few weeks ago, for those of you that weren't here, he talked about a project he was working on when he was assessing different funders and what were their models of system change. So you mentioned system change, and he talked about 7 different sort of things that he saw when he looked at what funders were actually doing. And so I want to sort of share those and sort of get your reaction to how you fit into this, because it seems to me like you're doing a lot of different things. So he talked about system change as being really either focused on cause and effect. How do we know what works? And really being funders that were really focused on metrics and measurement. He talked about funders that were very focused on empowering entrepreneurs and sort of creating that sort of entrepreneurial model. He talked about funders that think a lot about coordinating across different actors and sort of building that coordination. He talked about scaling and sort of taking ideas and sort of bringing them into a community, or sort of scaling them up. And then he also talked about scaling deep, which, going deep into a single community and really understanding that community. And so, just hearing you talk, right, you're doing a lot of those different things. And so how do you think about system change at the foundation?
So I think the last one, the going deep, is the thing that we don't do, and that actually frustrated me early on, because I got a lot of feedback that you should choose one thing and focus on it. And with the one thing meant kind of an industry specific thing, like you should choose education reform and really go deep. I recognize our limitations as a funder. I mean, we're not a $60 million endowment is not a large foundation, but we do a lot with that amount of money, and we punch way above our weight. So that's why we kind of do a little bit of a scattershot approach to things. But we recognize, so we have done, I think that if I had to choose one that we are more, that's kind of in our original theory of change. It's about entrepreneurial people who are come up with ideas and who will be able to make change with those ideas, because they will be able to attract the necessary funding, necessary support, necessary partners. And then either the political context will be supportive of them, or hopefully there's some way that they can aggregate enough clout from the community that the political context can be shifted a bit. I mean, I think that we're right now in a political context that no one seems to know what's here or there. But when we first cast that as our overall theory of change, things were a little more linear in terms of our thinking. So what we really do believe is, like, start with that idea and start with that person, and then give them the tools that they need and let them test and experiment, and let's give them a little free rein. And I think that one of the ideas with this is, when I first moved to Los Angeles, had an education reform network that I was doing in the evenings and hosting conversations, and I had a Yahoo groups. I mean, that's how long ago. I mentioned Yahoo groups and MTV. I mean, it was a long time ago. And I just needed a little bit of money, so I didn't have to rely on a Yahoo group, that I could actually have a laptop. I mean, there were a bunch of things. I was asking people to pay $10 or $20 for salads and pizzas, and I just needed someone to believe in me. And there was nowhere I could go. And I had a decent network from having come from the New Schools Venture Fund, but I was told that either I was too sophisticated in terms of the audience I was bringing to my events, and so I wasn't like the real grassroots activist, or that I was way too unsophisticated because I didn't have this big business plan. And I was thinking, I need like $10,000. I mean, that's all I need to give me a little bit of brain space. So I am constantly guided by, if we can be, and we give bigger grants than 10,000, and again, most of our grants are via My LA2050, but if we can be the funder that I wish had been out there when I was trying to hustle, that's the kind of funder I want to be. And we've taken risks. I mean, we've done, so Imagination Foundation, which is now part of 2-Bit Circus, was founded by a filmmaker who found a young boy in East Los Angeles named Kane. I don't know if people saw the Kane's Arcade video of the little kid with the cardboard arcade. So this is an unlikely social innovator, but he was a filmmaker who needed to have his car repaired, went to this auto body shop. There was a little boy there who had constructed a whole cardboard arcade, and day in, day out, no one came. This is a kid from an underprivileged background, and the filmmaker thought, I'm going to do something to bring people to Kane and give him a little, self-esteem boost. So he did that. There was a video that went viral online, and then he came to us and he said, I think there are more Kanes out there, and I think we can figure out a way to seek them out and uplift them. So we gave him a large grant. I got very involved early on with public relations assistance, legal assistance, not my providing those, but to connecting them to the right people and kind of the human and the social capital, being an advocate for them for other funders. And they then became the Imagination Foundation, which found Kanes all over the world, a global organization, Global Cardboard Challenge. And now they're part of 2-Bit Circus, which is a really interesting organization because it's a merger among between for-profits and nonprofits. So that's the sort of idea that worked. I mean, there were other ideas that didn't work. We funded some documentary films because we believe in the power of media and storytelling to uplift different issue areas. And I will say, with one of the documentarians, one was very sophisticated and very had a great reputation, and the topic just didn't fly. And the other one was, gosh, a real creative type and didn't really do a very good job with fundraising and bookkeeping. And that's where I think, oh, I should have had a little bit of a heavier hand in that one. The other one I couldn't really have done much about, but that one. So you just have to kind of test and experiment.
Yeah. So to think about sort of what you look for in the social innovation organizations you fund. So you've talked about the idea, you talked about some P's, passion and preparedness. So can you talk, what is it that you, what are the things that you look for?
Yeah, so I would say in preparedness, I'm constantly amazed by people who don't do their homework or don't, like, I'll meet with someone and I'll say something about LA2050, which is presumably why someone wants to meet with me, and then I find out they're not subscribed to the newsletter. And I can find out if they're subscribed to the newsletter or not, by the way. So I'm sort of like, oh, you didn't subscribe to, or, you know, what? So be prepared. I don't want to waste anyone else's time, and I don't want my time to be wasted. And again, I think that, but the main kernel is finding that, like, the necessity or that social market gap where it may not seem like a necessity, but that's how it's like, it's a crazy idea on a Friday, and then on a Monday it's like world-changing transformatives. But I think that someone needs to be able to articulate that necessity or why there's a gap in the social market, and then be able to say, okay, this is my theory about how I can make change in this gap. And be well researched and prepared, have that passion so that all of the other investors or potential employees or vendors will be able to buy into the vision, and then also have the ability to pivot. I didn't even know there was another P in this, but to have that ability. I'm reading a book about venture capital right now because I'm getting much more involved with our investment committee. And since I have my MBA, I know what I don't know, and I know that I don't want to be dangerous when I'm making recommendations. And part of what the venture capitalist from Andreessen Horowitz is talking about is the ability to pivot. And I'm like, oh, there are so many similarities in these different industries, and the ability to kind of have the humility to say, okay, my original hypothesis is not proving out. Here's how I think it's going to prove out. So those are sort of some of the elements that I look for.
Yeah, fabulous. So I wanted to ask you, so you're one of the funders in the Stockton Universal Basic Income Experiment sort of seed, and I was curious, like, that seems very different than a lot of the things that we're talking about. How did you come to that, and what has that experience been like?
So are people familiar with this, or what universal basic income is? It's guaranteed income. It's essentially unconditional cash transfers given to citizens or people. And there have been experiments done in different countries. This is basically looking at the fact that a lot of jobs will be automated, that there's not the same growth in terms of economic growth in countries, globally. And so our entry point to this was around access to capital. So the access to capital has been a big subject we've kind of tinkered with a little bit. So, and we've done this in a few different ways. We've supported organizations like Lyft that provides people, low income or people who've had some unfortunate circumstances, kind of get back on their feet with basically almost like a caseworker to provide work. So we brought them to Los Angeles. So we were thinking about access to capital from the very baseline, like just being able to make your rent, just being able to, to not have to live in your car, to have childcare so you can go to a job interview, something. And then we worked with a group called Learn, which is now called Inclusive Action for the City, and they support street vendors. And there are about 10,000 street vendors in Los Angeles who were illegal when we first got started working with them, and who have now had their work legalized. And most of them low income, new immigrants, and we saw working with Learn as a pathway out of poverty, entrepreneurship as a pathway out of poverty for them, but they needed capital. So they needed a loan to have their fruit cart, for instance, or get their permit via LA County Health. So a lot of access to capital work, and at a certain stage we also, as I said, worked with the White House, and we worked with the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which was run by Tom Khalil, who's now up in the Bay Area doing futures-oriented philanthropy. The Office of Science and Technology Policy, unfortunately, is no longer, and we were very excited about working with either White House to continue this work, because we had fellows, very mid-career fellows, who were working on inclusive entrepreneurship and access to capital. So one of our fellows worked on the Jobs Act, which allowed crowdfunding. So non-accredited investors, like any one of us can go online and do Kickstarter, write a check. This was part of the legislation that enabled this, which is all about spurring entrepreneurship. So we had dabbled with kind of a policy, testing things on the ground with nonprofits, and we're looking at this going, we are in a really bad state in terms of economic mobility, economic disparity. I mean, maybe we're chipping away at something, but something's not working. So we were talking to the people at the Economic Security Project, and they were talking about the universal basic income. And we actually had, like, internally a lot of debate about this. We were like, is this a strain? I mean, we're not sure what to make of this. But then we thought, you know what? The system's broken. We're working and trying to do what we can. Maybe these guys have the solution. So we went ahead and took a chance and said, okay, fine, you go ahead and let's do this. We initially had wanted to have more work done in Los Angeles because that's where we're centered. And ironically, Lyft is doing conditional cash transfer. So you have to go meet with your caseworker, and then you can get a cash transfer. But they said there's an amazing young mayor in Stockton who came from Stockton, went away, went to Stanford, came back, is committed to Stockton. Stockton is a little mini microcosm of the United States. And we said, okay, fine, let's try it. And so far it's been around for about a year in terms of the cash transfers. We're just posting stories about some of the recipients, and it can be life-changing. I mean, it's $400. I think it's 40% of Americans are at risk of not being able to make a $400 payment that can keep them from being homeless or not, keep them from getting medical care or not. I mean, that's really precarious, and that's a large amount of people. So that's why I'm thrilled that this is showing some initial good results. Again, there's still controversy. I mean, you're always going to have haters, especially if you're doing something a little bit different. But I'm really excited about this, and I'm excited that it's within a civic institution that can work at scale in the way that we can't work at scale. But we can provide the seed fund within the civic institution that someone else can take it to scale and someone else can promote it and amplify it.
Mm-hmm. Super interesting. All right, I'm going to give people a chance to ask questions as well. So just to give you a heads up that is coming. So you're involved in a lot of different organizations in Los Angeles. So can you talk a little bit about the social innovation landscape in Los Angeles and what those partnerships or collaborations or sort of community voices are like?
Yeah, I think so. I was actually just at an event yesterday around intergenerational opportunities, and it was a mostly philanthropic group, but it was a lot of different funders working together, which is a very nice thing to see, because when I first got started in philanthropy, there weren't Southern California grant makers, where I'm on the board and that I think very highly of, and that does a lot of collaboration. If you want to have a discussion around environmental impacts and how you can fund differently, they'll provide a lot of programming and training. But there wasn't a lot of that there. It was very much a closed door, and I was like the newbie going, oh, and I happened to know a few people who were willing to share proposals with me where they blacked out the names, but I had that to go with, because I was not given a lot of, I had an urgency and timing initiative when I first got started in philanthropy. I was given 6 weeks to give away $1 million, and going, okay, in LA and with what and how many, what size grants and what organizations. So I just did what I could do. So I'm encouraged to see more funders collaboratives. I'm encouraged to see, I think there's going to be more public engagement around the Olympics. I think that we were involved in the Olympic bid committee, so I got to sit in on some of those meetings that were more on business and philanthropy side, but there's a whole initiative that's for sustainability and legacy that I'm really excited about seeing with volunteerism and engaging everyday Angelenos. And the Olympics poll very well publicly, that everyone has this civic pride. So I'm encouraged to see more of that. I will say that some of the things that we've seen or been involved with, I mean, some of the organizations that we've supported or initiatives we've supported via My LA2050 have involved collaborations. Like there was something, Caltech Department of Water and Power and LAUSD all did an initiative wherein kids from LAUSD got mentored by Caltech students to work with the Department of Water and Power on clean energy initiatives. This was a pilot. It was not a raging success, but it was not a failure. But I loved it because you have a utility, a highly esteemed university, and a troubled, at times, school system working together. They're all getting exposure to each other, and they're doing real applied work. So it's nuggets like that I've especially gotten closer to via things that I've seen come through the Grants Challenge that have been really exciting to me. Yeah,
the bringing together. So Gary Painter sort of talks a lot about sort of his model of the social innovation process, and he talks about, I'm sort of curious where you see yourself in this process, right? So he talks about sort of, needs assessment, figuring out what are the needs that are there, sort of a co-production, engaging, experts and non-experts, and figuring out what possible solutions are, sort of piloting ideas, right, testing and scaling, and then diffusing, and sort of in every step of the way there's sort of a feedback loop of trying to learn. But is there a place in that whole model of innovation that you sort of see yourself as fitting best?
So I'm a little like multiple personalities in this, because with our LA2050 initiative, I think we've gone through that process, and we're now at the stage, we're kind of at the final stage where we're saying, okay, how can we make minor refinements or tweaks to the Grants Challenge process or to our reporting and research. I'm certainly not saying that it's that we've achieved all that we set out to achieve. We have not, but I think that we're farther along because we actually followed a much more adhered more to that formal structure. With some of our other initiatives, we're being I think that we are maybe more in the piloting. So I'll give you an example. We have done, the three original areas of funding that we focused on when we first launched the Goldhirsh Foundation, or relaunched the Goldhirsh Foundation about more than a decade ago, was we worked around opportunity, which was economic and educational opportunity, sustainability, which is environmental sustainability, and activation, which was kind of like media, digital tools. So we were early funders of Kiva, early funders of Donors Choose, more about the platform and the engagement rather than the actual, like, what are these different groups doing. We were interested in the fact that they were encouraging others to get involved. So I've referenced some of the documentaries that we've worked on. We've also worked with journalism. And Claire, who's one of my board members, I reference as a working journalist. She's on the board of ProPublica, which is an investigative journalism organization. And we've funded them because we see journalism as a voice in the media and as a civic voice that needs to be protected, that can be a safe place for people to go to have a dialogue, especially in this day and age. And as things have been heating up in the world, we've said, maybe our kind of activism is a little more in journalism, about a civil and civic dialogue. So we've upped some of our commitments to ProPublica, for instance, but we're testing, like, okay, we would like more of a California presence. So that's actually something we're testing right now. We've done a little bit of the needs assessment specifically in this civic space, and now we're going to pilot and see what happens. But I think we have to be adaptive to the environment around us. I mean, another example, climate change. I personally, Tara, am very interested in climate change and have always been. It's not always been a priority of the foundation. It's becoming more of a priority of the foundation as things become more dire. So actually some of the ProPublica work is going to be around climate change and California and what California is experiencing. So we're in a little bit of a funny time of kind of going back to the drawing board. We've got one program that's kind of like up and running. I just tell people, like, okay, do the newsletter, do the Grants Challenge. We've got that down, but now we're sort of exploring, what else are we doing here? What else can we do? Where can we have an influence, have a voice, and lift up other voices? So, yeah.
Terrific. All right, so let me open it up for some questions from the audience for Tara. Yeah.
Thank you so much for taking the time to make these secrets. I was wondering, you mentioned that you work with entrepreneurs who have very creative ideas. How developed do you expect their ideas to be in order for you to start working with them? Like, for example, the founder of Angelenos Foundation, how much of a model did he already have to have established for you to believe in that mission?
So I'll say some of these are not necessarily universal cases. It's more that we happen to know that we knew him before, so we knew what he was capable of doing in a completely different realm. It was, and we knew that if we came in with our skill set to match his skill set, and we really committed to this, and we gave enough money and enough of our time, we could give it a trying chance. So I would say like very little of a model at that stage. There is a woman. We actually haven't funded her, but she's come in to talk with us. She's Rachel Sumek, who was an undergraduate at UCLA, and she came up with a program called Swipes, like Swipe Out Hunger. I don't know if you all are familiar with this, but she came to us saying, I've been testing this and this idea, and she had already been testing and experimenting, so she had data. I would say that we want a little more data about, like, here's an idea, here's why I think I can execute it, and here's even something to show that I can execute it. Or even my example with me, I had built a lot of things on the side. I'd built a group, I'd built a community, I'd built kind of an engagement and activation that I could show people, but I couldn't. So I think there needs to be a little more there. Also, the other thing is the way that we work with kind of entrepreneurial people and ideas more so now, given that we launched LA2050 about 6 years ago, is really more through LA2050 and through the Grants Challenge. So we'll have individuals apply online to the Grants Challenge, and the better fleshed out and better articulated the vision is, and the more that people can show working with different partners, the better. So because we're not so much as like seeking out, I mean, it's right now we're also invitation only, so we don't seek out we're not like responding to individuals who come to us with an idea or whatnot. Yeah, and I'm doing a little more of that on the investment side though. So, yeah.
It seems like your foundation works a lot with like riskier endeavors and kind of values that risk. And with risk inherently comes failure. So like how has your foundation either like learned or adapted like ways to counteract like that risk so that you know like that the work is still effective and like your dollar still counts for something?
Yeah, that's a good question. So well, first of all, I think that our philosophy is really about philanthropy and risk. So I came from the private sector, and I always say I don't have to make a quarterly sales goal. I don't have to worry about what my investors think. My investors are the public, so why shouldn't I take a risk? I'm not in government. I'm not going to be voted out of office. I have my own other issues, but my board, and I need to do a good job and be a good manager. But I don't have the same risk profile in running a foundation that a lot of other groups do, and so I feel like, why shouldn't we take more risk? I mean, if we're not going to do it, I don't know who else is going to do it, because our risks are really low. So in terms of kind of from a meta perspective, that's philosophically what drives us to take more risk. From the more, I'd say more micro perspective about kind of opportunity cost. Okay, if we take a risk on this organization, it means we're going to take money away from this. And we have to do a calculated risk assessment. So I'll give you an example of something where we also got a lot of flack. But sometimes when we get flack, I think that's a really good thing. I mean, especially you have to consider the source of where the flack comes from. We did something when John Daisy was the superintendent of LAUSD. He wanted to put a social media person in the central. Okay, so a lot of the stuff I'm dating. It probably is not even making sense. I need to change some of my examples, but it's the one that just comes to mind. So he wanted to put someone. They didn't have Twitter, they didn't have Facebook. LAUSD is the second largest school system in the United States. So they were relying on, and they still do rely in many ways on some outdated modalities of communication. So we put money into hiring a social media coordinator to coordinate with the parents, the staff, the students, reaching hundreds of thousands of people. And some of the pushback we got was, why didn't you put a teacher in the classroom with that same money? And we looked at that and we thought, because the leverage and scale where we can make an impact is so much bigger than putting a teacher in a classroom. And teachers in classrooms are the most important assets I think we have in education, but this was how can we communicate across all these different respective groups? So we do have to look at we're not just going blindly like, okay, let's just scatter money here and there, but it really is calculated. We do take it seriously. I mean, I had someone recently say, we sometimes provide opportunities for people to go to conferences. And I had someone say, oh, well, you can just let the people pay the $1,500 for the conference or something. And I said, do you understand what $1,500 to a nonprofit means? I mean, that's huge. So that one was like a no-go. But something like the social media person at the central office in the LAUSD, yes, and I will defend that like until I can't.
You talked about risk just now, and then earlier you were talking about metrics and how you track outputs and outcomes. But when do you call something a success or a failure? Like, what kind of time horizon are you looking at? How quickly do you know if something is working or not working? That's it. I'll leave it there.
Sometimes I'm hesitant to make a call too soon, because something that looks like a failure, unless they've gone out of business, like that's then, okay, it's done. And we've had that. Yes, we've had 2 of those actually, where things have gone out of business, like, okay, that was a failure, but what can I learn from that? Like, what could I have done differently? Like, just talking about this one documentary is not dead in the water, but our involvement with it is. So what could I have done differently with that? So there are other things that have an interesting way of resurfacing, or where persistence really pays off. So there's, I actually won't name this organization, but there's an organization that had a lot of big funders come in, help launch it, and then the funders disappeared, retracted. They actually won an LA2050 grant. I didn't want to go super deep with them, but I was happy that they won the grant, happy to promote what they were doing. It felt like they were teetering on the edge for a while, and they will admit they were teetering on the edge for a while. They kind of fell out of favor. They lost some board members. They're about to make a huge announcement where they're going to be an amazing success because they're going to be able to reach so many people. They're going to be able to do very progressive, interesting work that's going to take us into the next century where we so desperately need it. So there's a little bit of patience and a little bit of, let's see how this plays out, and just the persistence of that we might need to see this through a little bit longer. There are other things. Sometimes I've been too patient. We did a project with Heal the Bay where we looked at a section of the LA River which needed to have, there was debate about having it, pulling up the concrete bottom and making it a soft basin for ecological purposes. And we came in and we said, we'll give a grant to try to figure out some best management practices. And then if this grant is successful and that this proves, then the Army Corps of Engineers, which is in charge of the LA River, can bring in millions of dollars. And we waited and waited and tried and waited, and nothing's happened with that. So I'm sort of, I don't know, the jury's still out on that. I mean, it didn't achieve the initial results that I'd wanted to achieve within this time frame, but who knows, maybe someone in another year or 2 or 3 will pick that up and say, you know what, this proves something and we are going to put the money into it. So sometimes it's just hard to tell.
Yeah.
In the back, yeah.
Excuse me, thank you. I work with children who are in a shelter situation, and my question is, I saw such participation with the climate strike, and I'm wondering what kind of innovation could we use to get those students and those kids who are in a different situation involved in climate change and, getting that going.
I think part of it is asking them how they see themselves and giving them agency in their future that they are inheriting, and just in any other population. They're young, they're bright, they've got potential. They're going to be the ones who are around 50 years, 60 years from now. So I would sort of say, and it really depends on the level of severity and everything else that's going on, but assuming they're in a supportive environment, I would say, how can they get involved? I mean, were there transportation limitations to getting them to participate with a climate strike? There's the Sunrise movement, which is this young, but it's skews a little bit. It's like it's kind of high older teens. There are different movements to kind of plug people in, but I also feel like having them make signs, having them get informed about what different issues are within climate change. I think there's something really really powerful there. The other thing, because it's top of mind from yesterday, was where they talked about intergenerational opportunities. And because one of the things that I'm just thinking about right now with Climate Strike is sort of the like, okay boomer, okay millennial, that discussion that's going back and forth, where it's sort of like, gosh, we all need each other and we can all learn so much from each other. But there was a group that was outside of Chicago. I don't know if they're still around, but it was called Generations of Hope, and they had foster care community kids come into a center where they had senior citizens, and they all worked together and they worked on projects together and they helped each other. And it was that kind of connectedness that they all felt, where they felt like they'd been kind of disenfranchised. Each group had felt disenfranchised or isolated. And then by bringing them together for a kind of a unified vision around something, whether it was a play activity or whether it was learning together. So I feel like there are different ways you can crack that nut. Yeah.
You talked a little bit about bridging to something like public funding with the Army Corps of Engineers. Mm-hmm. How do you think about kind of the different funding vehicles you have as part of innovation, and what are there things that you think are missing in that space in LA?
Yes. So the way we think about our funding is really across the board. So I look at that $60 million endowment, where I have the $3 million that I have to give away or spend every year. And I think, well, why am I not thinking about the other $57 million? Because that's where the real power is. So we think about different financial tools. Like we think about loans, we think about grants, and we think about investments. Oh, and then we think about contracts too sometimes. So for instance, I had a group come to me who said, we are interested in your making an investment in us. They were setting up a B Corp. They said, we're interested in you making an investment in us. And I said, you know what I'd rather hire you, have you use us as a case study, and then you can go out to potential investors. So just thinking about, okay, what's a win-win for all of us? We are never going to be the big funder. But if we can kind of make a plant in something like the mayor's office or the White House, or where someone can bring a good idea to light that can then be spread throughout a department, that's where the public dollars will come in. But I think really thinking, and we've actually been working on, since I've taken over running our investment committee, I've been doing something like very informal, just called CIO conversations, where I've been talking with family offices and chief investment officers for foundations, and talking with them about, how do you see these different sides of the house? Because it's different staff at different organizations. So it's an investment professional who has his or her MBA, has a finance degree, who's making the investments. The program side of the house is more around advocacy, nonprofit management. And just by virtue of my being I'm like the same person in my foundation, we're such a small group, I get the benefit of looking at this and thinking, why are you guys not talking to each other more? And why are you sort of dismissive each side of the other? And what I'm seeing and hearing from big foundations like, wow, you're talking to me, this is great, is that they're saying they're getting from some of like their private equity managers they've invested in from the investment side of the house, they're saying, we would like to talk to people on the program side of the house, because we're realizing about employee activism, for instance, and what about like organizing? We want to better understand this. So I'm hopeful that there's more of this merging, because I just feel like there should be. I don't mean every investment needs to have a pro-social lens to it. I mean, it'd be great. At some point it does, but I just think that we need to be thinking more holistically about all the access and the capital and the assets that we have.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I had a question about, so in like the last phase of social innovation, it's usually about scaling up and replicating and diffusing. And so I was wondering about your perspective as a funder, considering that you see yourself as kind of like seeding those initial projects. After you know something works and like you believe in the program, how do you go about making sure that it's replicated if it's, doing some social good?
This is where it gets really tough about making decisions. And this is where we've had conversations kind of over and over again, that where are we best suited? Where are we and where we find that there is less funding, less emphasis is in that initial seed funding for nonprofits. I mean, there's a lot for for-profits, and we look at other much bigger players in town, nationally, globally, who have the ability to write much bigger checks, have the ability to make bigger introductions. So we say, we know what we're good at. what we're also not good at, and we also are constantly learning both of those. But we say this suits us and this suits others. This is where we can have the highest and best use of our resources. So that's where but we will go out and advocate. I do a lot of letters of recommendation and reference for different organizations. I am always willing to talk. One of the groups I was talking to yesterday, where they got a $100,000 grant for us. They're now looking at a group for a $12 million grant. And I said, I know that we have obviously different scale, but I can talk about your responsiveness as a grantee, your efficacy as a grantee, you're setting forth really well articulated metrics, and then showing me where you met those or where you did not meet those. These are some values that across the board, whether you're making a $12 million grant or investment or a $100,000 or $10,000, these are important. It's about being professional. So we try where we can to continue to advocate. Or we might still be on a board or an advisory. But we try. We just recognize that we're not going to be able to write the big check.
So just as a quick follow-up on that, so you did mention that you've brought a couple things from elsewhere, like City Year, to LA. What made you decide on those sort of?
Yeah. No, it is. Right, absolutely. So we looked at what was a proven model somewhere else where they had great leadership, they had a great model, great community engagement, and where do we see a need in Los Angeles, and how can we make that connection? So with all three of those groups, so actually 4 of those groups that we brought, there was definitely a demonstrated need. We knew enough to know about the demonstrated need. That's the other thing. I mean, we're experts in very little, but we span across the board about what we do. But we knew enough about, for instance, civic engagement and education reform to know about that City Year does a great service. We need it here in Los Angeles. So we brought them. We did initial funding. We did a larger grant for them, multi-year grant also, which again is not what we do with My LA2050. We took a board position. My boss is still on their board, but he lives in Costa Rica right now, so I go to all of his board meetings for him, which is, oh boy, it's a lot. Got a lot of boards right now. And we hosted fundraiser dinners. We would show up to their volunteer events. Like, we really got involved with them and really as advocates, and continue to. But we recognize we're going to kind of give you we're going to plant the seeds for you. We're going to make the introductions, and then we're going to step back and let someone else take over. But we really needed to match the need with the model. And another group, Lyft. So Lyft is this amazing organization, and for many years we actually funded Lyft when they weren't in Los Angeles because we really liked the leader so much. She was stellar. She's now stepped away, and we helped bring a new CEO to the fold who's great, who's a native and who's from Los Angeles. But we kept saying, please come to Los Angeles, we need this. And she was very cautious, which I appreciate. And she said, I would like to have you all fund a feasibility study to see what the community reception would be like in Los Angeles. So we funded a feasibility study. We had someone work for 1 year before she came to Los Angeles. And then she expanded the model, and lo and behold, the person they hired as the ED is now the national CEO. It's a great, thriving organization. So we, with some of them, we were a little more, we weren't as diligent. That was probably the most diligent that we were. And it was really, it was good. And it was because of her and that model.
Yeah.
That was part of my question. Thank you for asking that. Also curious about, you used the term using your voice as an organization and you personally, and kind of connected to the scale up question. Not only do you it sounds like you make introductions for your grantees to potentially scale up. What role do you play, or could you play, in spreading that through philanthropy as funders sunset certain interests? What is the role then to make introductions or open doors so that the work is sustainable?
Well, I think that each funder really has its own respective endeavor and its own respective way of working. So one thing that we do is we have a newsletter. LA2050 has this newsletter that has ranged in size, but is right around 100,000 Angelenos on this newsletter, for instance, which is pretty good. I'm for a foundation of 3.5 people, basically. So people come into our office and they say, oh, this is it? There aren't 30 people? And I'm like, no, this is it. This is why we're a little frenetic. But we knew that was sort of an area where we could use our voice a little bit. I haven't seen as many foundation newsletters or digital presence. There hasn't been that same uptake, but I also see funders who have done amazing things working with elected officials, working with large collaborations, working with municipal bodies and agencies where we're just not playing, where they're talking about $100 million budgets and for an agency where they could take maybe a pilot project that we've funded, that we've uplifted and amplified and promoted, where we've posted their jobs, where we've promoted their events, we've promoted their research, and then they prove themselves and they can go to a bigger funder, and the bigger funder can then take them to an agency and say, have this program become part of this agency. So I think it really does depend on the funders. I mean, I'm on the board of Southern California Grant Makers, and we just each have a different way of doing it, but I think that even talking to each other about what works and what's right. I mean, what's right for me is not right for another foundation leader necessarily. And I have a lot to learn from them, and I hope they have something to learn from me. But we're all kind of like biting the animal in a different way.
Terrific. All right. Yeah. Last question. Yeah.
I'm trying to tie in three things here from the presentation you just made. How do you connect a socially innovative idea, a brand new one, within the context of something you mentioned which struck a chord with me, the upcoming LA Olympics, and within the vision of LA 2050?
So one of the things that we did because we were involved with the Olympics, we're involved with LA 2050, we're involved with innovation, is we were working with the mayor's office and the Olympic bid committee on engagement and volunteerism in Los Angeles. And one of our metrics is about volunteer rates, which are very low in Los Angeles, very sad to say. And so one of the things that we did is we said, you know what, we can provide, this is another kind of civic capital grant. We can provide a grant in Mayor Garcetti's office for it's now called the Mayor's Office of Volunteer Engagement. They have an initiative called Volunteer LA. We can provide that to sort of serve as the go-between between the Olympics and the Olympic body and Los Angeles from the city perspective. We can provide the funding, we can attend the meetings, we can kind of float volunteer opportunities in, but we have to support the middleman basically. So that's an example of how we said this would be a good way to help support these multiple initiatives, because we can provide the funding, we can promote the opportunities. We also talked with them early on, and this kind of came and went. We talked with them about the metrics that we have for our connect goal, so making LA the best place to connect. Part of some of the metrics in there are government responsiveness to citizen needs, rates of volunteerism, voting rates. So we said we can track these metrics, we can report on them, we can give grants to organizations who are working on these respective metrics, but we're not owning them. We have no real power in that. Who has real power in that? There are a number of different governmental organizations mostly who have power in that. So we talked with the Move Volunteer LA group and said, do you guys want to track via these metrics? So we talked about that initially, but I hope that answers the question.
Terrific. All right, so we are sadly out of time, so thank you, Chair, for joining us.